Okay, guys, now we are going to dive into the Civil War itself and take a look somewhat briefly at the conflict. There are far too many battles and conflicts in the war to be able to assess all of them in this lecture. In fact, to be able to adequately do that, you would really need an entire course just on the Civil War. But what we're going to do here for this week is we're going to look at the first 2 years and some change of the Civil War, and I will be highlighting just a handful of some of the conflicts during these first 2 or so years. Again, this does not cover the full range of battles, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't significant battles that I haven't covered. In other words, I'm covering a handful of what I consider some of the most significant conflicts during these years, but again, there are others as well, okay? So we're going to begin by looking at the year 1861. Ultimately, the war will go from 1861 until April of 1865, and we're going to start off by, of course, going chronologically, looking here at 1861, and then we'll continue on to 1862. And then we will end today by looking at some major changes, including the Emancipation Proclamation and the development of full black regiments with an emphasis on the 54th Massachusetts. So with that said, let's remember that prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, there are multiple causes for this war. By this point, I'm assuming you have a fairly decent grasp of those. But the last straw, if you will, is the attack upon Fort Sumter, and this was essentially a Confederate victory in that they were successful in bombarding the fort. But that's going to have a lasting consequence because now the conflict is on, and Abraham Lincoln is going to respond. So let's see what happens. It states here that the attack on Fort Sumter inaugurated civil war, and many men rushed to enlist. In fact, there were many men on both sides, North and South, who hurried to get to the recruitment office because they thought that the conflict would end before they could get a taste of battle. In fact, this was one of the misnomers that many individuals at the beginning of the war had. They believed that the war would be very, very quick. And that there would be little bloodshed. And in some ways, this is sort of underscored in the fact that Lincoln initially only calls up 75,000 volunteers. Now, of course, Lincoln being commander-in-chief is able to change this at any time that he wishes, and in fact he will. But initially, he's only calling up 75,000 volunteers, and these men respond. But it's just interesting to think at the beginning, in retrospect, we can look back at the war, and everything is 20/20 in hindsight, but we can look back at this war and say, man, this was an incredibly bloody campaign. 700,000 plus men died in this. And so we can go, yeah, clearly this was a major conflict. But for those who were fighting it in the beginning, not by everybody, mind you, there were a handful of folks, including William Tecumseh Sherman, who thought that the war would last long. In fact, Shelby Foote in Ken Burns's most famed Civil War documentary stated that, even William Tecumseh Sherman, who thought that the war would last a long time, and in fact he was deemed to be insane because he thought the war would last a long time, even his estimates of the number of dead were low. I think he estimated the war would cost something like 200,000 men, and of course it cost way more than that. But for the most part, people generally thought that the war would end quickly. And in fact, when we get to the first battle of Bull Run, or first battle of Manassas, depending upon which side you are on, you'll be able to see that this mentality that the war would be quick went deep into a lot of minds of a lot of folk. But initially, right after Fort Sumter is attacked, this is Lincoln's response. He's going to call up 75,000 volunteers, and it says by April 19th, Lincoln had his 75,000, and he will proclaim a blockade of southern ports. One of the reasons why a blockade is instituted, as we will talk about here in a second, is due in part to a plan created by General Winfield Scott, who was the main general at this point in time, who came up with a plan known as the Anaconda Plan. It was a plan that for many Union generals, they did not want to follow it because they thought it would take too long. But we'll talk about that here in a second. But my point is that right after Fort Sumter is attacked, Lincoln does respond. He responds with 75,000. He responds with a blockade. Okay? Now, one thing before we move on. There are states still in the Union that have yet to secede, okay, that have not yet left the Union. And Lincoln has to sort of watch his steps to a degree to try and ensure that some of these border states who might leave the Union, he has to do what he can do to try to ensure that they don't leave the Union, right? He wants to not have them secede. So some of the actions that Lincoln takes are controversial, and we'll see that here in a second. But depending upon your perspective, right, he does what he does in order to hold the Union together. So with that, let's move forward. Here you can see just a proclamation by the president, 75,000 volunteers and an extra session of Congress. At this point, African Americans, free or otherwise, are not permitted to be part of the military. That will change in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation, and you will see the development of all black regiments, including the 54th Massachusetts. But at this point, at the very beginning of the war, they are not permitted to fight. But again, you know, initially, at least for Lincoln, he is not fighting this war at the beginning to free slaves. I mean, one of the things that Lincoln says is, if I have to save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, then I will do it. If I can save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, then I will do that. You know, initially, you know, Lincoln seems to have fought the war in the beginning for the preservation of the Union. Now, of course, this changes over the course of the war, and the nature of the war changes this so that it does become an issue of freeing them and freeing slaves. Although even with the Emancipation Proclamation, as we will see, this has as much political and military purposes for being issued as it does, you know, moral issues. And we can talk about that because there's definitely different ideas about the Emancipation Proclamation and why it was issued. But we'll present some of those arguments here in a little bit. Okay, let's move on. Okay, this states that Lincoln went beyond mobilizing troops. One of the other things that he does, and he got criticized for this both at the time and by contemporaries, but Lincoln does suspend the right to habeas corpus, and he does this along the Philadelphia-Washington route. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with what this means, the suspension of habeas corpus would mean that anybody could be arrested and thrown in jail. And initially, Lincoln suspends habeas corpus along this route because there are individuals that are making it difficult for the military to be able to move and maneuver. There are individuals that are inclined to speak in favor of the Confederacy and have pro-secessionist views. And so Lincoln does suspend habeas corpus. Now, again, initially it's along the Philadelphia-Washington route, but eventually it will be suspended for the entire country. Now, just so that we can be fair on both sides, right, Lincoln was criticized for this. There were abuses of civil liberties going on here. But the larger question that we need to ask ourselves is, if Lincoln doesn't suspend habeas corpus, the Union might collapse. The Union might fall because you have, you know, ideas being spread. You have individuals doing things that are making it difficult. And so for Lincoln and for others, you know, I don't want to say that Lincoln was necessarily acting, you know, on his own as a dictator or a tyrant by any stretch of the imagination. He definitely brought these things before Congress. But, you know, is it okay to suspend civil liberties during a time of war? You know, and I'm not here to try and answer that question, just to pose the question. You know, and for Lincoln, obviously, for him, it was very important to maintain that Union and hold it together. Okay, of course, on the other side of that argument is, you know, civil liberties being abused or being violated during a time of war, even during any time, could be seen as an abuse of power. But I'll let you guys kind of weigh in on that. I've provided for you a video by Eric Foner, one of the preeminent historians of this period. And, you know, hear what he has to say and see where you land on it, because I think it's an interesting conversation, but it is something that takes place during this early period of the war. Okay, now in all of this action, 4 more states will eventually leave to go to the Confederacy. Virginia, you can see, was the first, and then Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina followed in their wake. So it's not as if those states who were in the Union when the war started remained in the Union. Indeed, they didn't. Interestingly, when the war begins, Robert E. Lee, who will eventually come to lead the Confederacy, he in fact does this after a gentleman by the name of Johnston is wounded during the Battle of Seven Pines during the Peninsular Campaign. But initially, Lincoln, asks Robert E. Lee to lead the Army of the Potomac, or the Union Army, and Lee says he will not do it. He says he cannot raise an army to invade his own home, and by home he's referring to Virginia. And so he resigns his commission in the U.S. military and heads back to Virginia, eventually to be the leading commander of the Confederacy. So, but this is kind of what's going on in the early days of the war following the attack at Fort Sumter. Now, let's move forward. Now, the idea here, as it states, is that the Union victory in this war was inevitable, and that the loss of the Confederacy has been understood as kind of a romantic lost cause. Now, from hindsight, we can sort of say, yeah, the Union won because it had to win. But what we don't want to do is to engage in teleological history, and that is that because something happened, it therefore had to happen. The reality is that during the war, during much of the war, the Confederacy proved the superior army, especially in 1861, 1862. And I would even argue that in 1864, when Lincoln is up for re-election, it's kind of, unclear as to whether or not the Confederacy is going to win or lose. And in some respects, Lincoln's re-election may have gone right down the drain. Now, obviously it doesn't. He gets reelected in 1864, but in some measure that's because of success that's being had. Oftentimes throughout this war, morale was low because the Army of the Potomac just had defeat after defeat after defeat. So we don't want to look at this and say, well, the Union had to win. Now that's stated, and as you can see from this chart, the Union, the North, has a number of advantages that if you were a betting person, you would probably put your money on the Union from the beginning, okay? And a lot of the advantages that the Union had were industrial advantages, right? You can take a look here. It says manufactured goods. They made 92% of all the manufactured goods in the United States at this time, right? They had the most merchant ships. They had the most rail. They had the most grain. They had the larger number of farms. They had a larger number of iron production, 94%. 82% of all the banking came from there. And one of the other things that makes the Union slightly stronger is that if they were to fight a war of attrition, which is basically kill as many people as you can, the North has more people to pull from. Remember that when the war began, the South has a total population of about 9 million people, 4 million of which are slaves, which, these individuals are not going to be willingly given guns to fight for the Confederacy. And of course, a number of the rest of the 5 million are elderly or women or children who are not going to fight. So, the South has a lot of things against it. And so from kind of a service level assessment, we would say, yeah, the Union's going to win. They have to win. Look at all their advantages. And, that's not wrong. And in many ways, when it came down to it towards the end of the war, I would even argue by 64, it's very clear that the Confederacy probably can't sustain itself, okay, because it simply can't produce the items of war that it needs. At one point during the war, they don't even have any food. They're going through, horse poop to try to find undigested kernels of corn to eat. Now that's, towards the very end of the war, but life gets very desperate. And, one of the reasons why not a boycott, but I'm trying to think stop imports and exports from coming in and out of the region. For some reason, it's leaving my mind right now. But one of the reasons why the Anaconda Plan wanted to stop and halt imports and exports from going into the South was because that would hurt their economy. And in fact, the Anaconda Plan that was initially created by Winfield Scott was intended to slowly hurt the American or the Southern economy so that they would feel that pressure and then stop, right? But these are advantages that the North possess. Let's move forward. On the other hand, the South has military advantages. And this is not to say that the generals and the military that Lincoln was commanding and that, you know, other generals were commanding was bad. It's just that in terms of outmaneuvering and tactics and, you know, all of those things that come together to create an effective, efficient fighting force, the South tended to have a better military. You also have to realize that the majority of this war, in fact, I dare say almost all of it, was fought on Southern territory. They were fighting on their home turf. I mean, the most northern part that this war really got, say for naval battles, was Pennsylvania at the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay, and so, you know, there is a military advantage that the South has. And you will see in 1861, 62, and even in 63, at the very beginning of that year, the South, you know, has a strategy that is working for them. And, you know, it does not appear as if they were going to collapse just out of anywhere. They were fighting, and they were fighting hard and strong. Now you can also see here I've got some pictures of some of the more well-known Southern generals. Of course, you've got on the top right Robert E. Lee, and you've got next to him his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson. Jackson will not live to see the end of this war. He dies during this. Below him, you've got Pierre G.T. or P.G.T. Beauregard. P.G.T. Beauregard was the individual who, you know, gave the order to fire upon Fort Sumter. Next to him, you've got Joseph E. Johnston. Initially, Johnston, and he's the middle left, Johnston was initially the individual in charge of the Confederate forces, but after being wounded during the Peninsular Campaign, the command goes to Robert E. Lee. Below him, you've got John B. Hood, and then you've got Albert Sidney Johnston. And another individual who is not listed here who was incredibly important to Lee was a gentleman by the name of J.E.B. Stuart, who was head of his cavalry, and James Longstreet, who was, and we'll talk about more when we get to the Battle of Gettysburg. But these men, you know, very good at what they do, okay? Very good at what they do. By contrast, if we take a look at the military on the Union side, you'll see that they were not as able to keep their generals for long periods of time. So, for example, let me show you. Let's move on. You can see here it says that the North, on the other hand, struggled with finding adequate men to lead the entire Union Army. Now, that does not mean that these men were unable to do the job. Some of them were not really wanting to do the job, but you know, based upon personality differences and ideas about how the war should be fought or their abilities, the Union changed out generals very quickly, and you can see them listed here. Irvin McDowell, the very first general, you know, goes and fights the very first battle of the war, the Battle of Bull Run, or the first Battle of Bull Run, and his men eventually just flee in the wake of battle. They run away, and so he's replaced with George B. McClellan, who in many respects was a professional soldier and could very well have done the job, although he and Lincoln did not get along very well. I think McClellan was known to call Lincoln, you know, a baboon, or a well-intentioned baboon. Eventually, McClellan will run against Abraham Lincoln for the presidency in 1864. Obviously, he loses. But following the Battle of Antietam, he will be replaced with a gentleman by the name of Burnside. Then Burnside gets replaced with Joseph E. Hooker. Then Joseph E. Hooker gets replaced by George Meade. And then finally, you get Ulysses S. Grant, who becomes lieutenant general. Washington is the only other general in U.S. history up to this point to have held that title. And Ulysses S. Grant fights very differently than the rest of these individuals. He fights like Lee in some respects, that when you see that your enemy is down, you do not give them a moment to breathe. You stay on top of him, and you keep fighting and you keep fighting until eventually they are done. And so, there's some advantages and disadvantages to both sides. Obviously, as aforementioned, the Union has a lot more industrial and manufacturing power. They also have a greater population. But at the other side, the South's got home field advantage, and they have got, again, I would say perhaps more capable soldiers, more capable generals, but definitely more consistent generals than the Union had, because the Union just kept changing them out for different and variant reasons. And of course, I could get into the deep specifics on each of these, but again, for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to sort of just put that out there for you. Okay. All right, let's keep plowing through. Okay, so depending upon your point of view, you might well argue that Fort Sumter was the first battle of the Civil War. I personally see that as sort of the last major cause which inaugurated the Civil War, and there are a number of historians who agree with this. But whether you want to consider Fort Sumter the first or not the first major battle after the war had sort of begun was the first Battle of Bull Run, or the first Battle of Manassas. In fact, battles were named different things. By some people called battles by nearby physical features. So Bull Run Creek. So the Northerners would refer to the first battle as Bull Run because it was near Bull Run Creek, while Confederates named battles after nearby towns. So you'd had Manassas Junction. This battle, you could rightly call it Bull Run or Manassas. It's up to you what you want to call it. But this is the first battle to erupt after the attack on Fort Sumter, and it takes place on July 21st, 1861. So you've got a couple months or so that have passed or elapsed since Fort Sumter was attacked before the very first battle of the war erupts. And you can see you've got about 5,000 or so folks who die in this particular engagement. Now, the first Battle of Bull Run is an interesting battle. This battle begins very well for the Union. And in fact, again, as Shelby Foote would say in Ken Burton's Civil War documentary, is that right after the battle started to go, it appeared as if the Union was going to win, and there were a number of soldiers who stopped to pick up souvenirs, thinking, "Hey, the battle's over, the Rebs are running away, and the thing's done, and we're going to go back to normal." Of course, that's not what happened. In the end, the Confederacy is going to get reinforcements via train, by the railroad, which was a first in war, and the Confederacy will ultimately be victorious at the first Battle of Bull Run. Now, one of the things that happens is that the Union troops begin to flee. They begin to run. And Irvin McDowell, who was commanding these troops, was incapable, if you will, of keeping his men in line and making sure that they maintained a fighting force. And it's for this reason, among some others, but ultimately McDowell would prove ineffective, and the first battle of the war goes to the Confederacy. But one of the interesting factoids about the first Battle of Bull Run is that it underscores just how, I don't want to say naive in sort of a negative sense, but the people were generally naive about the length of this conflict. And so much so that people came out with picnics and bottles of champagne, and senators rode out in order to watch this battle because, in many ways they didn't understand how bloody and nasty this would be. And part of the reason for the war being as long as it was and being as bloody as it was due to technological innovation. I mean, in many ways, the technology had outstripped the strategies. It's a lot like you would see in World War I. Right? You can't do frontal charges when you have machine guns rolling at you in World War I, so you got to dig trench. Well, the same can be said here. The technology of the day was, outstripping the strategies in some respects, and so it provided an opportunity for this war to go on even longer. But again, this first Battle of Bull Run is interesting for a number of reasons. But for me, I think one of the interesting things is just that fact that, hey, this sort of shattered that perception in some ways that this war was going to be quick and it was going to end very, very quickly. Okay. Now, as far as battles during 1861 can go, there are a number of them, but I'm going to stop with just the first Battle of Bull Run. As I've probably mentioned before, I'm not a military historian by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm just going to try and hit some of the highlights, lest we go on and on and on and on and on talking about battle after battle. But the first Battle of Bull Run, so called because there will be a second Battle of Bull Run. It takes place in 1862. And it actually takes place during the Peninsular Campaign, which we will be talking about. And the second Battle of Bull Run will also be a Confederate victory. One of Robert E. Lee's, I guess you could argue, one of his more strategic victories. So that's kind of 1861 in a rapid nutshell. Of course, there's a lot more that could be said and perhaps should be said, but for the sake of making sure we at least hit the highlights here, I'm gonna move forward. Okay, so in the aftermath of Bull Run, it says at the beginning of the first Battle of Bull Run, the Union Congress authorized a call for 500,000 more men, and at the conclusion, another 500,000. Here to the right, you can see Major General Irvin McDowell as he looked there in 1861. Okay. Tyndall, and Tyndall is an author. His name is George Brown Tyndall, and he co-authored a book with a gentleman by the name of David Shy. They wrote a book called America, A Narrative History, and they write the following. They say, the Battle of Bull Run demonstrated that the war would not be decided with one sudden stroke. General Winfield Scott, the 75-year-old commander of the Union armies, had predicted as much, and now Lincoln was to fall back upon Scott's three-pronged Anaconda strategy. Okay, let's move down to the next slide. Here you can sort of see what the Anaconda strategy would have looked like. Okay, much like a snake would wrap around the South and squeeze it into submission, so this was the Anaconda plan. Now, generally, the plan called for a blockade of southern ports. As you can see, they would have blockaded, all those southern ports. And then if you look at the Mississippi River, which is right there next to Mississippi, just to the left of Mississippi, the Anaconda Plan then called for the Union to take possession of the Mississippi River and literally cut the South in half. Okay? One of the things you need to understand is that the South was largely fed, or significantly fed, by materials coming out of Louisiana and Texas. And he who controlled the Mississippi River, and you can actually see, if you look at the word Mississippi and just go down to the left, you'll see a town there called Vicksburg. Eventually, the Union will take possession of Vicksburg in 1863. In fact, Grant will siege the town of Vicksburg and take possession of it. And once he does, the Union takes possession of the Mississippi River. But for the first couple of years, the Union does not control that river exclusively. And so Winfield Scott says, hey, we need to take possession of the river. Not everyone enjoyed this plan. They thought it was going to be too slow of a plan. Some people, specifically, even Lincoln, wasn't totally thrilled with this plan, although he does fall back on it following the loss of First Bull Run. But there are a number of generals who really want to take it to the South. They want to take more of a frontal attack against the South, and they thought that this plan was going to take too long. They're already of the opinion that the war isn't going to last very long, so this is a strategy for some that just wasn't going to work. Now, elements of this plan definitely did get put into place. The blockade for sure did, and even as the war progresses, elements of this plan will be put into place. But this is the plan that Winfield Scott has, and again, portions of it will be implemented. So, again, 1861, there you go. There are some naval engagements that take place in 1861, but for the most part, and I don't want to say it's completely quiet during the remainder of 1861, by no means is that true, but again, for the sake of time, let's move to 1862. All right, so the American Civil War, 1862. one of the interesting conflicts that actually erupts during the early months of 1862, in March, I believe it was, is there was a naval battle of the ironclads. And in fact, one of the things that had happened was the Confederacy had found an old Union ship, and they began to put iron plates on the side of the ship. And this made them pretty much impenetrable to other navies or to other ships at that time. And eventually the Union responds by building their own ironclad ship. It had, I think, over 20 different patentable inventions on this ship. And in fact, the Industrial Revolution and the Civil War very much went hand in hand. As one developed, so did the other. But the Battle of the Ironclads, as it came to be known, this is an interesting naval engagement, perhaps the most popular of the period. But just thought I'd briefly mention that. But 1862, let's go ahead and start off by understanding that in addition to naval conflicts, the war is being fought on two fronts. The first front, or a front, is the Western Theater, and you can see this is a fairly large theater. It encompasses a great deal of territory, and some really significant battles take place in this theater. If you go all the way to the left, you can see Vicksburg, which there was the battle and siege of Vicksburg, which lasted from 1862 until 1863. You've got the Battle of Shiloh, which took place in 1862. That, in fact, was an interesting conflict where, in the end, a gentleman by the name of Henry Halleck will replace General Grant. Grant had been, a surprise attack at Shiloh, but Grant had a reputation for being drunk, and there was a rumor spread that Grant, the reason why he was surprise attacked, was because he and his men were drunk, which was not true. Although Grant did drink, and he drank heavily at times, from my understanding, he did not drink while engaged with the enemy. But that's another battle. You got Battle of Chattanooga, 1863, and then, of course, perhaps one of the most infamous battles, infamous maneuvers of the war, is Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864, as he goes and basically turns the South into firewood. And even to this day, I don't think there's too many Southerners. Well, I'm speculating here, but I suspect that there are some Southerners who do not like William Tecumseh Sherman. So this is one theater of the war. The other theater is the Eastern Theater. Here you can see the Eastern Theater. It encompassed mainly Virginia, but it's got some other areas as well. You're going to see the Peninsular Campaign is going to take place in the Eastern Theater. You've got the Battle of Gettysburg, which takes place in the Eastern Theater. So just understand that, you might have certain sections of the country that are more engaged in battle at one point and more quiet at another point, but there are these two sections going on. So let's now move in to take a look at one of the most significant battles to take place during 1862, and that is the Battle of Antietam. All right, so I had said on the last slide at the end that we were going to look at the Battle of Antietam, but before we get into the Battle of Antietam, I want to take a look here at the Peninsular Campaign. The Peninsular Campaign is so called this because George B. McClellan, who replaced Irvin McDowell following the First Battle of Bull Run, he decides that what he wants to do is he wants to capture the city of Richmond, the capital, and he's going to do this by taking troops and supplies, and he's going to bring them down to Fort Monroe, and then he would go up the peninsula and slug his way into the capital. And here, the intent is take the capital and the conflict. In the end, this is not going to be a successful campaign, but it is one of the first major campaigns, if not the first major campaign of the war. Now, George B. McClellan is a professional soldier. The fact that he was able to maneuver the number of horses and materials and things that he needed to Fort Monroe was a master of organization and engineering here. So, McClellan is definitely a man that is capable of getting the job done. But as I see it, he has one major flaw. And that flaw is that frequently he overestimates the strength of the enemy. And in fact, when we get to the Battle of Antietam, we're going to see that this is going to come back to sort of haunt him a little bit, where he will not attack immediately, even though he could have and should have, because in some respects he's fearful of the size of the opposing force. McClellan was loved by his troops. This was a man who I think sort of saw himself as sort of a fatherly figure. And I think in some respects, and again, this is conjecture, but I suspect it pained him to see his troops die, and this might also help to explain why he didn't engage them as frequently as he would like, and this lack of engagement at times created tension between him and Abraham Lincoln. By the time that the Peninsular Campaign gets underway, by the way, Lincoln has experienced some personal loss. His son died of bilious fever. It creates a lot of turmoil in their home, a lot of stress between he and his wife, Mary Todd, and what have you. But I've digressed here a little bit. Let's get back to the Peninsular Campaign. It says the Peninsular Campaign, fought during the spring and summer of 1862, was an attempt by George B. McClellan to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond from the southeast. Pressured by Lincoln to mount an offensive, Union forces had been dormant since the previous July. McClellan moved his Army of the Potomac down the Chesapeake Bay, landed it at Fort Monroe, and marched it up the peninsula between the James and York rivers. And along the way, as he begins to march his way towards Richmond, he is going to get into a number of engagements with the Confederacy. At this point, under the command of General Johnston, Tyndall writes, "This bold move put the Union forces within 60 miles of the Confederate capital. Thousands of Richmond residents fled the city in panic, but McClellan waited to strike, failing to capitalize on his advantages." And time again, you see this, unfortunately, is that McClellan does not capitalize upon advantages that he had, which may well have resulted in not only more victories, but more remarkable victories that may well have resulted in the war ending sooner. I mean, one might argue, and of course it's a counterfactual, we can't know for sure, but one might argue that had McClellan acted sooner, he may have been able to take Richmond, maybe applying pressure, right, so that the thing would come to an end. One could also make that argument about the Battle of Antietam as well, okay? But this is his attempt. Go down to Monroe, head up to try and capture the capital. Here you have a kind of a visual. You can see Fort Monroe down there at the very bottom, right there where you see kind of the volume icon right there by Hampton Roads. That's where he lands. And then he goes right up the peninsula. And he has a number of battles with the Confederacy as he begins to slug his way towards Richmond. And if you go up towards the top where it says Henrico by the Chickahominy River, you can see the Battle of Seven Pines, May 31st through June 1st. This is where a major turning point takes place, because it's during the Battle of Seven Pines that Johnston is wounded and Robert E. Lee is brought in as the, eventually will be brought in as the commanding general of the Confederate forces. One of the things that definitely helps to bring the Peninsular Campaign to an end is the Second Battle of Bull Run, which Lee enacts to try to relieve pressure from the Peninsular Campaign. But ultimately, in the end, this campaign is not successful. Richmond is not captured in 1862 or in 1863. And so, yeah, great effort on their part, McClellan, but he didn't quite do it. And in some respects, it's because he did not act soon enough, at certain points in the game. Okay? All right. So as aforementioned, at the Battle of Seven Pines, it says Johnston was wounded during the battle and Lee took command. Tyndall once again writes, dignified yet fiery, Robert E. Lee was an audacious commander. He led by example and his men loved him. Unlike Joseph Johnston, Lee enjoyed Jefferson Davis's trust. For those of you who are not familiar, Jefferson Davis is the president of the Confederacy. It says, more important, he knew how to use the talents of his superb field commanders, and in fact, he did. Lee, for the most part, was a pretty good strategist. There were definitely times when Lee made tactical errors, particularly during the Battle of Gettysburg. But for the most part, he seems to have had a grasp of what it was he was doing. It says the first of Lee's attacks occurred on June 26th, and this is, of course, after he takes command. And after 2 days of fighting, he forced McClellan to abandon his supply line and begin a retreat back to the James River. The battle ended McClellan's campaign to take Richmond. As aforementioned, the Peninsular Campaign is not successful. Tyndall once again writes, he says, on July 9th, 1862, when Abraham Lincoln visited George B. McClellan's headquarters, the general, we're talking about McClellan, complained to Abraham Lincoln that the reason why the Peninsular Campaign failed was because the administration, quote, had failed to support him adequately, and he instructed the president at length on military strategy. Okay? Now, this is, of course, a form of insubordination. It creates a great deal of tension between Lincoln and McClellan. Tyndall goes on to state that this type of insubordination was ample reason to remove McClellan. Lincoln returned to Washington and on July 11th called Henry Halleck from the West to take charge as general-in-chief. But ultimately, McClellan will not leave the scene. He is going to come back. He will be back for the Battle of Antietam, which is what we will now speak about. All right, so some context here so that you can understand where we're going. The Battle of Antietam comes after a string of victories that Lee had. And according to Tyndall, he writes, a victorious Lee made a momentous decision. He would invade the North and perhaps gain foreign recognition and military supplies for the Confederacy. In fact, one of the things we have to be very mindful of is that Lee and the Confederacy definitely needed supplies. And one of the things that they were hoping to get, and not just supplies, they wanted an alliance. And the British were contemplating allying themselves with the Confederacy. That hope, however, will be remarkably destroyed after the war becomes an issue about freeing slaves, because at this point Britain had already freed their slaves, and it was unlikely that they were going to support a country, the Confederacy, who was ostensibly fighting a war to protect the institution of slavery. But the point here is that Lee wants to move his army north in order to gain this recognition and strike a blow against the Army of the Potomac. But what happens is that Lee corresponded with his generals, and he had at one point written a letter, wrapped it up in a cigar box, and along the route, the cigars are dropped. And who picks the cigars up? None other than the Union Army. And so what the Union now has is a letter that basically identifies the strength of Lee's armies, where many of his men were positioned. In fact, according to Tyndall, he states that the paper revealed that Lee had divided his army, sending Stonewall Jackson off to take Harper's Ferry. So McClellan now has all the information he could ever need. And if he had immediately grouped up and attacked, he may have had a major victory. Now, one of the things that is coming up at this point in the history of the United States is that there is a beginning to be a rumble about emancipation and the need for emancipation. But at this point, the war is not going well. The United States has not gained major victories yet. And so Lincoln is very ecstatic in some respects that, they now have this letter. And in fact, McClellan at one point says, here is a letter with which if I can't beat Bobby Lee, I'll go home. Because in fact, McClellan could have responded and acted sooner, but he doesn't. Lincoln wants this conflict to happen because he wants to gain a major victory in some respects to boost morale, but also because he is planning on issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, so he gets this letter, knows the strength of the army, but instead of immediately acting, he waits 16 hours. Okay, and that's where this slide picks up. It says still optimistic despite their 16-hour delay. It says still optimistic, both McClellan and Lincoln decided to go ahead with the attack. September 17th, 1862, the Union Army attacked the Confederate lines. It says the Confederate lines were falling apart, but they soon received reinforcements from A.P. Hill's division, who plunged into the action, attacking the Union Army's left flank. Outnumbered 2-1, the Confederates were still able to fight the Union Army essentially to a standoff, killing 2,108 and wounding 10,000. In the end, Antietam is it's a victory for the Union, but it's not a crushing victory. It's not a Waterloo by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, Tyndall writes the following. He says, disgusted by McClellan's failure to gain a truly decisive victory, President Lincoln sent a message to General McClellan stating, quote, "I have just read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done which fatigues them anything?" In other words, Lincoln says, really, what have you done? You're complaining, you're tired, this, that, but what have you really done? You haven't gained a decisive victory, at least not the victory that they were looking for. Okay. According to Tyndall, again, it says that the Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American history. Up to that point, of course, it will be eclipsed by other battles. It says some 6,400 soldiers on both sides were killed and another 15,000 wounded. Surveying the battlefield afterward, a Union officer counted hundreds of dead bodies lying in rows and in piles. The scene was, quote, sickening, harrowing, and horrible. Oh, what a terrible sight. And ultimately, the question is, was it worth it? Well, in some ways, yes, because even though it wasn't a major crushing victory, this battle does give the impetus to the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, the Emancipation Proclamation places the war on a new playing field. It changes the nature of the war to not just a war about preserving the Union, but also a war to freeing the slaves and extending this idea of freedom. Here you can see some of those harrowing images of the Battle of Sharpsburg or Antietam. Sorry, again, different names for different battles. Tyndall writes, the Battle of Antietam was the turning point in the war. It revived sagging Northern morale. It emboldened Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in the Confederate States, and it dashed the Confederacy's hopes of foreign recognition. Yet the war was far from over. In his search for a fighting general, Lincoln now made the worst choice of all. He turned to Ambrose E. Burnside, who had twice before turned down the job on the grounds that he felt unfit for so large a command. Now, again, remember, we talked about this. The commanders, the generals, they constantly are getting changed and changed out. McClellan gets changed out. Now we get this gentleman here, Ambrose Burnside, who had said, look, I don't feel qualified for the war. I don't feel, not for the war, but for the job. But Lincoln says, hey, man, it's on you. You got it. Here's just yet another image of that. Photography, of course, I think we're still working with daguerreotypes at this point, although I might be inaccurate about that. Check that factoid. But photography is still a relatively new art form, but it definitely allows for people to see the carnage in a way that they had never seen before. It's a laborious task to take a photograph at this point in time, with using plates and what have you. But here you can see just how destructive this war actually was. Okay, but if the Battle of Antietam cost the lives of many, and it wasn't a crushing defeat, but it was that battle that allowed for the Emancipation Proclamation to be issued. It says, on the whole, McClellan thought he had done a splendid job and that his victory was more than complete. It says Lincoln did not see that way. No decisive victory had been claimed, and ultimately the battle had been fought to a draw. Consequently, he was removed from command, and he was sent to New Jersey to do recruiting. He never commanded troops again thereafter. But what McClellan will do following the war, or I guess during the midst of it, is he becomes a politician, and he decides to run for the presidency in 1864, and he almost takes about 49% of the popular vote. He does not beat Abraham Lincoln in that 1864 election, but he runs as a Democrat and a peace Democrat to a degree. But the Battle of Antietam, definitely one of the more significant conflicts during 1862. Okay, because as aforementioned, it does lead us to the Emancipation Proclamation, which we will now look at. All right, so now we get to the Emancipation Proclamation, and I've got a video on this that I definitely want you to watch when this is all said and done, but just a couple of things that I think should be said about this is that in some ways, and in many ways, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued as a war measure. This was, strategic in many ways. Now, with that said, the Emancipation Proclamation, although it did not necessarily free the slaves in the South, it did encourage a number of slaves to flee from the South. It does create a situation where now the United States is going to allow for the creation of all black regiments. And there's a caveat to that because officers couldn't be black, they had to be white, but it does set that up. And perhaps the most significant thing is that the Emancipation Proclamation sets the United States on a course towards eventually abrogating the institution of slavery. In fact, Abraham Lincoln stated, as he wrote his name to the Emancipation Proclamation, he wrote, and I quote, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing the right thing than I do in signing this paper," end quote. Now, there's a whole discussion about, Lincoln as the great emancipator, and Lincoln as the friend of the black man, and there's a lot of historical debate about whether or not Lincoln was a staunch abolitionist or an anti-slavery guy, or whether or not Lincoln, thought that blacks and whites were equal. And there's definitely solid arguments to be made on both sides of the argument. Again, I think Eric Foner has a really good text where he sort of explores Abraham Lincoln's position with respects to slavery and African Americans. But the one thing that I think can be said is that even though the Emancipation itself does not free the slaves in the South, and you can actually see here in the orange mustard kind of color where what states were affected, quote unquote, affected by the Emancipation. Lincoln is doing things that ultimately bring us to a place where we do get to end slavery. Now, one thing that we will note here is that there were states that were omitted from the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the proclamation itself was initially, I think it was in September of 1862 that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, but it wasn't to take effect until January 1st, 1863. Now, there were certain states that were omitted from the Emancipation Proclamation. You can see it here. Kentucky being one of them, Delaware, Maryland, what have you. So, the Emancipation Proclamation does not free the slaves that were in the Union. It only frees the slaves that are in states that are in an active state of rebellion. And so just be aware that this does not, cover the whole breadth of the thing. Tyndall writes the following. He says, "The time to act came at last after the Battle of Antietam. On September 22nd, 1862, 5 days after Lee's Confederates had been forced to retreat from Maryland, Lincoln issued a proclamation in which he repeated that his object was mainly to restore the Union and that he favored proposals for paying slaveholders for their losses. But the main burden of the document was his warning that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in the rebel states would be forever free." Now, of course, being able to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation was going to be darn near impossible, and ultimately it will require an amendment, the 13th Amendment, to ultimately free the slaves in the United States. But again, this gets us towards that process. Now, I mentioned that in many ways, the Emancipation was a military maneuver, and indeed, this is in fact the case, okay? First and foremost, by freeing the slaves, the Southern economy would be damaged because, as Tyndall notes, slave labor supported the rebel war effort. So by freeing them and by encouraging them to run away, then this could potentially damage the Southern economy. It allows for the Union to basically keep at bay foreign alliances. As aforementioned, the British and the French were not going to support the Confederacy if their objective was to, maintain the institution of slavery. So it keeps them from doing that. And one might also wonder why, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't immediately go into an effect. And one might argue that, you know, the reason why there was a few months in between its issuing and it's actually going into, you know, working, was that perhaps Lincoln wanted the South to stop and come back into the Union. Because remember what it states. It says that by January 1st, any states that are in a state of rebellion, then those slaves are free. Well, if Tennessee, for example, had decided to end their secessionist position and come back into the Union, then come January 1st, their slaves would not have been set free, or North Carolina, or Arkansas, or what have you, right? So there is a move here, a military maneuver here for the emancipation. Now, not everybody's in love with this thing. In fact, there are a number of people in the North, their names are, or they've been called Copperheads by Northerners. And these are individuals that are peace Democrats. They want to see the war come to an end. These Copperheads tend to be very anti-Lincoln administration. They call his administration the Black administration because they believe that he and the Republican Party are simply fighting this war to abolish slavery, and they don't want to see that happen necessarily. And for them, the Emancipation Proclamation is just evidence of this. So not everybody is on board with the Emancipation Proclamation, but it does get issued, and it does go into effect on January 1st. Ultimately, it doesn't free the slaves, at least not permanently, hence the need for the 13th Amendment, but a milestone, a major milestone in U.S. history. And I think Lincoln once said that if my name ever goes down in history for anything, it will be for this. And definitely, he wasn't wrong. Now, again, multiple debates about whether or not Lincoln is the great emancipator, you know, his position about African Americans, what have you. You know, we can have that discourse, but for now, let's just leave that with that. Okay, so we then start the 1863. Now, the year 1863 is a pivotal moment for the war, particularly for the Union, because it's during this year that a number of battles take place that are very beneficial to the Union cause. And two of these battles, of course, would be the Battle of Gettysburg, which I'm sure you've heard of, and we will definitely be talking about that battle, but we're going to do so next week. And the other one is the Battle of Vicksburg, okay? Very, very important victory. And then, of course, there's a third one known as the Battle of Chattanooga. And this, in some ways, is kind of a turning point for the Union during this period, okay? One thing that I want to make mention of before we conclude for today is that at the start of 1863, you begin to see the development and formation of all black regiments. So I'm going to briefly make mention of that, and then we'll conclude. All right, so early in February 1863, Massachusetts the governor calls, John Andrew calls for the formation of an all-black regiment. And ultimately, this black regiment will be referred to as the 54th Massachusetts. It'll be led by a gentleman by the name of Robert Gould Shaw. This regiment was made very popular in the very well-done film called Glory, starring Denzel Washington, Matthew Broderick, Morgan Freeman, among many, many others. But Robert Gould Shaw came from a somewhat prominent abolitionist family. He was docketed to lead these individuals, lead the 54th Massachusetts. As it was, unfortunately, he would not survive to see the end of the war. He is killed as the 54th Massachusetts attempts to defend Fort Wagner. But the 54th Massachusetts underscores and illustrates that by 1863, now we're going to have African Americans not only being fought for, but now they are in fact fighting for their own freedom. It states here, and we'll end with this, by the end of the war, almost 180,000 African Americans had served in the U.S. colored troops, providing around 10% of the Union Army total. 10%. It says some 80% of the quote-unquote colored troops were former slaves or free blacks from the South. And in fact, perhaps two of the most famous or significant, I don't want to say significant, but famous, were Frederick Douglass's two sons. They actually joined the war here. It says some 38,000 gave their lives. In the Navy, African Americans accounted for about a fourth of all enlistments. Of these, more than 2,800 died. And so it's a formidable moment here at the start of 1863. But we've got an hour or so, so let's stop here and we'll look at some of the major battles of 1863 through 65 next week. All right, guys, have a blessed week.